This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Rebels from the Allied Democratic Forces kill at least 12 people in DRC's eastern town of Beni. Ethiopia's Sidama minority votes on autonomy in the latest test for the restive region. And the African Union pushes for manufacturing and venturing into exports. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. And with me in studio is Ramanyang with a preview of your business news.
That's right, Lindy. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. More West African countries are calling for fresh talks around the future of the CFA franc. And there seems to be no end in sight for South African Airways' devastating strike. We'll have the latest details in the course of the hour. For now, though, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Lindy.
Thanks, Rama. Well, in our top story, rebels have attacked the DRC's eastern town of Beni, killing at least 12 people. According to eyewitness accounts, members of the Allied Democratic Forces used machetes in the attack. The ADF continues to stage retaliatory attacks targeting civilians. This comes as the Congolese engage in a large-scale operation against the militant group. Last week, ADF rebels killed 14 people in Beni. The Congolese army enjoys support from the UN peacekeepers in the region. The local community, however, has accused the UN of not offering sufficient protection. Residents barricaded roads in the city and threw stones at UN vehicles. Well, let's get the very latest on this now. We're joined by CGTN's Chris Ochambringa in the Congolese capital of Kinshasa. Chris, devastating attack so soon after one that just took place last week. What more can you tell us about this particular incident and the 12 people that were left dead?
Well, this incident happened last night, and this morning a senior Congolese soldier issued a press release in the eastern town of Beni, and it said that they are going to step up the fight against the Allied Democratic Forces. They are going to increase the number of troops that will pursue them in the eastern part of the DRC in order to wipe them out from the area. The people in that area are very disappointed, with the FARDC, and they have been asking for more protection from the government and UN peacekeeping forces. But the government officials are saying, they need to be collaborating with the locals, so that they can, get rid of the Allied Democratic Forces in eastern DRC. Lindy?
And Chris, tell us a little bit more about how people in Beni are reacting to these attacks. You mentioned that there is disappointment, and we know, of course, that some of the UN vehicles have been attacked with stones. Just how are people really feeling in terms of their safety in Beni?
Well, many people in Beni region are sick and tired of the situation. Almost every week there's an attack by Allied Democratic Forces. Just last week there were 15 people who were killed, and civil society organizations in that part of the country are saying that about more than 40 people have been killed over the past 2 weeks. And so people are saying, look, there's a very strong presence of the UN peacekeepers and the FARDC soldiers, that's the Congolese army. After President Felix Tshisekedi ordered a large-scale military operation that started in October, the 30th of October, they were hoping that, these killings will end. And so they're very disappointed that the people who are supposed to be protecting them are very slow to react to these attacks that are being carried out very regularly. But the UN and the Congolese army has been saying that, look, they cannot be deployed in each and every area of Beni, and so they need to work very closely with the people to inform them about any suspicious activity in their area, or any rebels who may have infiltrated the area, so that they can respond very quickly. And so that is the situation, that people here are really tired of these killings that keep on happening. Lindy?
And has government been able to appease the people of Beni? Has there been any official response from the government?
Well, the government officials here in Kinshasa haven't issued any statement, but the local officials in Beni have said, look, they have tried to calm down the people, to reassure them that they are going to step up the effort, the fight against the Allied Democratic Forces. They have told the people to trust them, to collaborate with them, so that they can report any suspicious activity, and which will lead to them, deploying troops rapidly so that they bring this outbreak to an end. The ADF has really caused a lot of trouble in eastern DRC. They have been around since 1995. It's a Ugandan Islamist group that was flushed out from Uganda by the UPDF, the Ugandan army, entered eastern DRC, and they have been killing people. Some officials are saying, they are not very sure whether this group is really linked to, foreign forces, because there's the Islamic State that has claimed, having links with the Allied Democratic Forces, but people are very doubtful about that part, that theory, and so Congolese are just hoping that these killings will end very soon.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much, Chris Ochamringa, joining us there live from Kinshasa. Let's head to Ethiopia now, where a referendum to grant autonomy to one of the main ethnic regions has been taking place this Wednesday. If the referendum passes, the Sidama will comprise Ethiopia's 10th region. This will give it control of local taxes, education, security and legal processes in the region. Now, around 2.3 million voters are registered at nearly 1,700 polling stations. The Sidama make up about 4% of Ethiopia's 105 million people. Many voters lined up before dawn at polling stations to cast their ballots.
I arrived here at 2 a.m. in order to cast my vote early. This is the day we've been waiting for. It's like when a woman waits for the day she will give birth. I thank God for having this day, and that is why I came early to cast my vote.
Well, as that voting continues, CGTN's Girum Chalana explains to us what it takes under the Ethiopian constitution to form an autonomous regional government.
According to the constitution of Ethiopia, each nation and nationality is given a generous right in order to form their autonomous regions within the federal government. In this regard, the constitution has also put procedures for such. We would like to form a region on our own kinds of questions. First, it's mandatory that the request is submitted to the House of Federation, which is a house formed by representatives of different ethnic groups of the country, and should be constitutionally valid as well. When and if all legal requirements are fulfilled, then the Electoral Board of Ethiopia will come on board to place the final but important condition for forming a state, that is, staging a referendum. So in the case of Sidama, the same constitutional procedure of submitting the request and doing it under the law has been made. As a result, the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia has called for voters to register. 2.3 million of them have done so. And through the more than 1,600 polling stations, Sidamans are now casting their votes to decide whether to form an autonomous region or remain in the Southern Nations and Nationalities and Peoples region. If Sidamans succeed, it will become the 8th regional government in Ethiopia. Grumjala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now, the African Union is promoting manufacturing on the continent and encouraging businesses to venture into the export market through its Africa Industrialization Day initiative. The AU is facilitating discussions among African entrepreneurs at its headquarters in Ethiopia ahead of the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in 2020. Colette Wanjoy reports from Addis Ababa.
Kenyan Amina Harsi is investing in a Ugandan sugar factory. The business, located in northern Uganda, will begin production in April. It will produce 165,000 tons of sugar per day.
In 1 year, that we will be having a circulation of money in northern Uganda about 143 billion. This is a place there was no money. And if you look at mine, there will be also other services. People will want now to to uplift their standard of living, so there will be houses being built, because there's money now, but before there was no money there.
Amina is attending the Africa Industrialization Week in Addis Ababa. The focus this year is how Africans can increase manufacturing and export more within the continent. The African Union wants to encourage more manufacturers like Amina, who plans to export sugar to Congo and South Sudan.
I've just been here and I've been told that food which has been imported in Africa is $50 billion. When we have all the rivers, we have all the lakes, we have very many unutilized land, and we are still importing, it is just shame.
Santa Joyce Laker heads 4,000 sugarcane growers supplying Amina's factory. She says local people will be key to growing business as the continent enters a new era of industrialization.
We are the backbone of African nation. The moment government and these institutions bring us on the drawing board, trust me, Africa will be a different continent. But they have left out the consumers and the suppliers of the raw material. That's why our growth is very slow, because the big bulk of the community are left out.
Entrepreneurs, though, are encouraged by discussions at this event, especially those looking to export. Irene Momo has been producing child skincare products for 5 years, and her target market is China. She has changed her packaging 3 times to meet the expectations of the market there.
Certification, of course, from Kenya is different from certification in China, so we are working on that. The other challenge is the IPs in the 2 countries. I have an IP on my product in Kenya. We also need to do an IP, and we have actually started the process of the intellectual property rights in China. Number 3, branding is critical.
According to the United Nations Industrialization Development Organization, there are at least 12 million young entrants like this in the market every year. The entrepreneurs attending the Africa Industrialization Week say for them to grow their businesses, trading across borders must be simplified and barriers to it reduced. They also want to see an investment in the digital economy, which will help improve productivity. Those like Irene, who have already experienced the demands of the international market, are focusing on perfecting their production to ensure that they compete with other products globally. Colette Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now, as African countries gear up to implement the historic Free Trade Area Agreement, the UN Secretary-General is urging leaders to pursue economic growth that benefits both the people and the planet. Antonio Guterres made the appeal in his message for Africa Industrialization Day, observed annually on the 20th of November. Well, CGTN's Nick Harper is in New York and joins us live now for more on this story. Nick, the UN Secretary General's message all about growth that benefits both the people and the planet. Tell us more about his message to African leaders on Africa Industrialization Day.
That's right, Antonio Guterres saying that this year marks a milestone for the African continent when it comes to that economic growth development. However, he did push very hard on this idea of it being a balancing act, that yes, people need to benefit, but we also need to be careful of the planet around us. So he talked about the idea that industrial development was of critical importance to the African continent. He said that it helped to create a sustained and inclusive economic growth model. But he did warn that it was time to adopt a holistic approach to industrial policy. He said it was very important to have those strong partnerships between different groups, but at the same time there needed to be green and clean strategies. He talked about the climate crisis and said that whatever happens in industrial terms needs to very much consider the planet around us to make sure that it doesn't get negatively impacted by this need for growth on the continent.
And Nick, when it comes to this balancing act, as you say, what are some of the policy areas that the UN chief is encouraging Africa to focus on?
Yes, of course, the UN can make the push for more industrialization, but it's up to the individual governments around Africa to come up with those policies. But the type of things that the UN wants to see is a strengthening of capital and financial markets in the individual countries, but also regionally as well. And that involves, the UN chief is saying, improved access to funds, in particular to those small industries, those small companies, those rural activities that are taking place. It comes down to sustainable development as well, that idea of making sure that any of the business practices adopted are sustainable for the people, but also that the planet is not negatively impacted. And he spent some time talking about manufacturing. He said that at this stage, the African continent is already seeing a manufacturing sector that's growing beyond the global average, but he said it needed to be ramped up even more. His prediction is that the manufacturing sector across the continent will more than double by the year 2025. He says it means millions of jobs for Africans right across the continent, but he says that needs to be stepped up even more in the hope of hitting those industrialization targets.
And Nick, of course, what about the United Nations itself? How does the Secretary General see the organization facilitating Africa's industrial development?
Well, the UN is there to raise awareness. It's also there to highlight the challenges that are faced for different sectors, for different countries as well. But it also has a specific agency to work with the different countries. The UN Industrial Development Organization. The idea is that that works closely with the different nations, but it also engages other UN agencies to come up with initiatives that will benefit people on the ground. The idea of creating industrial parks, the idea of creating specific business zones in different countries, also working on the transfer of technologies between different countries and exploring renewable energies. The UN Secretary General reiterated the fact that up until the year 2025, this decade is being called by the United Nations the third industrial development decade for Africa. And the UN Secretary General says that makes it very clear that the UN is committed to industrialization on the African continent, and it hopes to be able to work with different countries and different regions to be able to push that forward.
Nick Harper, thank you so much. Joining us there live from New York on the Secretary General's message to Africa on Africa Industrialization Day. Let's now head to Berlin, where the G20 Compact Africa Summit is taking place. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling for reforms on the African continent as a way of attracting German investment. She says her country is committed to boosting private investment through microeconomic reforms, which she says have already made some progress. Last year, the German government unveiled over $1 billion in support of development projects in Africa. Meanwhile, the German Chancellor signed various partnership agreements with Tunisia and Ghana. The German Development Ministry was awarded contracts for construction of a water supply in Tunisia and one for putting up a textile factory in Ghana. Meanwhile, Chancellor Merkel has cited terrorism in some parts of Africa and rapid population growth as some of the challenges affecting the continent and which are hampering foreign investment. But she did not mention that Europe and the entire world are also sharing in challenges posed by climate change, which have also hit the continent. Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, Zimbabwe police used tear gas, batons to disperse opposition supporters. And a Nigerian woman seeks to raise awareness on Down syndrome.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
We We start now in Zimbabwe, where several people have been injured after police used tear gas to disperse hundreds of opposition MDC supporters. The supporters had gathered to hear a speech by Nelson Chamisa in the capital on Wednesday. CGTN's Farai Mokutuya has more.
MDC Alliance supporters had gathered at the party's headquarters in Harare Central Business District to hear Nelson Chamisa deliver what was dubbed a Hope for the Nation address. The opposition leader's speech comes amidst growing public frustration over failure to address an economic crisis that has been characterized by triple-digit inflation and persistent shortages of fuel, cash and electricity. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has called for time to address the challenges, but claims to have made political and democratic reforms. The Southern African country is enduring its worst economic and political crisis since 2008. Back then, the situation was stabilized by a coalition government brokered by neighboring South Africa, which earlier this week said the economic crisis engulfing Zimbabwe at present could only be resolved by bringing an end to intractable political differences. The MDC Alliance has so far refused to be part of a political dialogue initiated by President Emmerson Mnangagwa in February. Farai Mokutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
There are millions of people living with Down syndrome worldwide, and in developing countries like Nigeria, people still battle with understanding the condition and accepting it. But one woman in Lagos has taken up the challenge to advocate for the rights of children with Down syndrome after her own child was born with the condition. As CGTN's Deju Badmus reports, her journey is based on her personal experience.
She's the face of Down syndrome in Nigeria and one of the staunchest advocates for people living with the condition on the continent. 32 years ago, Rose Modi gave birth to a girl child with Down syndrome. And with little information available about the condition, she battled societal stigma and faced challenges caring for her newborn.
When I found out that she has this condition, I made up my mind that I was going to create an awareness. Because even within the medical society, they knew next to nothing about that condition. And but it took me another nearly 12 years before I decided to set up an organized foundation to not only create awareness, but to reach out and help other families that have children with this condition.
Her Down Syndrome Foundation is not only helping to fight off stigma, but also giving a new lease of life to these kids affected by the condition while teaching them life skills. And apart from receiving formal education, the 50 kids at the Down Syndrome Foundation learn computer skills, hairstyling, skincare, and makeup. Through her foundation, Modi is advocating for the rights of children with Down syndrome and calling on parents to understand the condition so they can be more accepting of their kids.
The stigmatization actually began from the family. You go to a family, maybe a family of 4, you would only see 3 being brought out there. The other one would be locked away because the families were feeling ashamed. They used to feel ashamed of letting people know that they have children who have this condition.
The Down Syndrome Foundation of Nigeria dedicates the month of October each year to provide awareness for the condition. 3 decades down the line, public awareness level of the condition has really improved.
If you go and interview 2, 3, 4, 5 people, at least 1 or 2 will tell you, oh yes, they know about what Down syndrome is. But before then, they would ask you, what's that? I remember when we first started, there was a lady that came to me. He said, what is this thing you call dancing drum? Because is it that when they beat the drum, the children dance? Because they didn't even know what it was about. When they heard about it, they did not even understand what it was about. But now it's not happening anymore.
Helen Ojogo has twin girls who have Down syndrome. She recalls her confusion as to the condition of her twin girls until she encountered Modi and the Down Syndrome Foundation. She now advises parents on how to handle kids like hers.
I advise any parents that have this child to show that child love. That is all they need. If you can show them love, any other thing is secondary.
But there's a lot more to be done. Modi is concerned that the right structure to care for the kids are lacking in the country. She's currently on the lookout for partnerships to better cater for the kids with Down syndrome. And with the disability bill recently signed into law in Nigeria, she's hopeful about the future of her children. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Meanwhile, in South Africa, premature births are the leading cause of death in children under the age of 5. Globally, around 15 million children are born preterm every year. In 2015, 1 million infants died as a result. CGTN's Julie Shire has more.
It was meant to be a happy time for Marie Botha, but in her 19th week of pregnancy, her baby stopped growing, and 5 weeks later, she went in for an emergency cesarean. Baby Botha weighed just 400 grams.
We didn't see her. They just took her away and you know, stabilized her so that, the doctors can work with her. I wasn't allowed to see her for 24 hours. We couldn't touch her. Her skin was too, if you touch her, her skin would break and we couldn't touch her. You could see her heart shining through her skin, like it was a dark spot where her heart was.
In the weeks that followed, things took a turn for the worse. Marie suffered renal failure. She wasn't able to bond with her baby or breastfeed her. Medical bills soared and the trauma escalated.
It was absolute hell. Waking up every day knowing that your child is fighting her own battle. You have to fight your battle because you need to stay alive for her. She's fighting. You go through a lot of emotions. You go through a lot of things in your head. You go through depression. You go through times of, I started having a lot of anxiety attacks.
Medical advances and lots of nurturing have helped increase survival chances for preterm babies. Many go on to live healthy and happy lives, but there are still thousands who don't go beyond the first few days of life.
80% of babies that are born prematurely die within the first 2 hours of life. And then those who are born very low birth weight will die in the next few weeks, very likely. And very few make it because there are so many obviously adverse consequences to prematurity.
Marie eventually recovered after 2 months and she was able to hold her baby and nurture her. Little Roashi is now 6 months old but is still in hospital.
She went through a lot of ups and downs, but she's a fighter. She's my hero through and through because she's been through so much and she just never gave up. There were so many days that she could have just said, I'm done. And she never did. But she's doing so well now.
Prematurity is often the result of a mother's failing health, and if preterm babies survive, they can suffer lifelong effects that can be challenging. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, as the G20 Compact Africa Summit continues in Berlin, CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy looks at Germany's interaction with the African continent throughout history.
During the scramble and partitioning of Africa by European powers, Germany was there. The European nations' portion of the continent thus were present-day Tanzania, Namibia, Rwanda, Burundi, Togo and Cameroon. But the rise of one Adolf Hitler and his like-minded contemporaries in Europe set the world for yet another conflict after the First World War, the World War II. Atrocities were committed by both the Allied and Axis nations in various parts of Europe, Asia and Africa, as the world witnessed what has since become the worst conflict ever witnessed. It left millions dead and the global economy in ruins. Germany lost the war. It also bore the burden of paying reparations to the victims of atrocities. It had already lost the colonies after the First World War, as the Versailles Treaty of 1919 placed them under Allied powers. The country has since recovered and managed to stamp its authority in the world of technology and innovation, making it the most respected economy in Europe. But conflicts in various parts of the world, especially in Africa and the Middle East, together with economic hardships, have seen Germany bear the brunt of migration. The influx of refugees and Chancellor Angela Merkel policies still continue to inform her legacy in Germany. She feels that German investments in Africa is key in ensuring economic security, thus reducing illegal migration.
We believe, and I'm deeply convinced about this, that more transparency can encourage more investment in these countries. Because for investors from G20 countries, such as German medium-sized companies, it is very, very important that there is trust. We want to create incentives so that when the countries participating in Compact with Africa are successful, investment conditions for companies are improved.
So far, the country has entered investment protection treaties with Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya and Angola. Germany's automobile industry leads its investment in Africa, with companies such as BMW, Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen having factories and assembly lines in countries such as South Africa, Kenya and Nigeria. GTZ, which is a German development agency, also has a strong footprint in the continent. Massive deposits of resources, a young population, and the need to stamp their influence in Africa are some of the things that make the continent very attractive. But they will have to pay catch-up to China, which is already miles ahead. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN.
Now let's turn to the latest developments in Hong Kong. Protesters have been barricaded inside the Hong Kong Polytechnic University since late last week. Hong Kong police briefed the media about the current situation at the university. CGTN's Xu Shin-chen has that report.
Right behind me, it is the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, where it is still occupied by some 100 die-hard protesters. According to the president of PolyU, J.G. 20 of those remaining 100 are students from PolyU, and no details of the others yet. In Wednesday evening, police met the press outside the PolyU campus. Ho Yun-sing, the superintendent at Yalton District, said that now some 1,000 have been arrested, with 300 under the age of 18. And those minors have been let go after the police took their information. The police once again said they want to resolve these PolyU occupation peacefully. In the meantime, the SAR government responded to the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act passing through the U.S. Senate. The government opposed the U.S. Act and said passing such an act would hurt the bilateral ties and mutual benefits between the U.S. and Hong Kong. Previously, David Wong, the Hong Kong deputy for the National People's Congress, told me that Hong Kong is an international financial center, and just to have this act being discussed and analyzed will harm the confidence of international investors here in Hong Kong, and the act could further encourage protesters to do more destruction to the city. In addition, the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions also criticized the passing of the act, saying the U.S. Senate has been ignoring the violent destruction that rioters have done to the city and using excuses of human rights and democracy to interfere in Hong Kong's local affairs. The Federation also urged the U.S. to respect the principles of one country, two systems. At the same time, classes have resumed for primary and secondaries for the time being, following a week-long suspension due to escalating violence from the ongoing protests. However, after the Education Bureau announced schools would reopen on Wednesday, some protesters still proceeded to disrupt traffic to prevent students returning to school. Luckily, no major incidents have affected students so far. Xu Xin-chen, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Staying with this story, Hong Kong police say they are doing all they can to ensure the ongoing standoff at the prominent university in the city has a peaceful conclusion.
We understand that the public concern about the situation in the PolyU campus, where some underage youth are still holding up there. So the police have actively liaised with different stakeholders in search for a peaceful solution for the whole situation. Apart from peaceful means, we also adopt a flexible approach to solve the problem. In this regard, we make a special arrangement for underage people as long as they give up their weapon and leave the campus in a peaceful manner. We do not arrest them immediately, but we record down their personal details and then let them go. But of course, we will reserve the right to pursue their case later.
Now, the chief superintendent said the police had taken the names of around 300 people under the age of 18 who have left the university. He added that while 700 protesters had been arrested, there was still a small group which was refusing to come out. He said efforts were being made to clear obstructions and police were keeping close communication with the leaders of the various groups involved. He said ambulances and first aid staff were being allowed to do their work, and police are now waiting for those remaining protesters to leave the campus voluntarily. And time now for your business news with Ramanyan.
Indeed, at about 18:35 GMT, business is coming up in 60 seconds.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. See GTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Let's start in the world of development finance. The African Development Bank, also more commonly known as the AFDB, has agreed to a $250 million trade funding deal with the financial services group ABSA. This is in line with AFDB's plan to foster inter- and intra-African trade and to reduce the trade financing gap across the continent. Now, according to reports, the two institutions will share the default risk on a portfolio of eligible trade transactions originated by issuing banks within the continent. That's, of course, subject to confirmation by ABSA for the duration of the facility. In the meantime, ABSA is leveraging AFDB's AAA rating, and it will underwrite trade transactions issued by African issuing banks. Targeted sectors are fairly broad: agriculture, energy and light manufacturing. The focus will be on small and medium-sized enterprises in low-income African countries. Now, in the meantime, unions are escalating a crippling strike at South African Airways after talks between them and management broke down. These negotiations collapse leaves the state-run carrier at risk of liquidation without a government guarantee to secure further bank funding.
While we were in the midst of negotiations, after they'd placed an offer on the table of 6.5%, which we believe could have been accepted by our members and would have been enough to settle the strike, they then withdrew the offer literally at the 11th hour. It is completely incorrect that you can make an offer and then just suddenly withdraw it, which is exactly what South African Airways management did. They claimed when they withdrew the offer that they didn't have a mandate, they suddenly don't have money, and they're putting back on the table what was the original offer, which was the very reason that our members are still on strike.
Uber drivers in Nigeria have attempted to block a road in Abuja to protest against what they describe as unfair business practices by the American tech firm. Now, the drivers are complaining about a new 25% commission that's being taken by the online transport network from their earnings. In South Africa and in Switzerland, Uber collects only 15% commission from the drivers. Now, the strike comes when Uber drivers in Kenya went in protest over unfair business practices in July this year. They were on strike because of what they describe as low wages and appalling working conditions. In a statement released in July, Uber said at the time it was putting in mechanisms to address the concerns that have been raised by their drivers. On to Cote d'Ivoire now. Its cotton output for the 2019-2020 season is forecast to hit a record 510,000 tonnes, up from about 468,000 tonnes the previous season. The cotton season in the West African country runs from May to April. Sowing takes place from April to June, with harvesting in October to January. Cote d'Ivoire, once upon a time, was a major cotton exporter in Africa, with an annual output of some 400,000 tons of the fabric. But this was before the 2002 to 2003 civil war that split the country in two and decimated production. Since then, Cote d'Ivoire has struggled to regain its position, but it has dedicated its efforts a lot more to cocoa production. With improved cotton output, the government has said it aims to achieve 600,000 tons of production by 2020. Now, the debate around the CFA franc is intensifying in French-speaking African countries. There have been calls on regional leaders there to withdraw from this monetary cooperation agreement with France. Now, the latest voice on that front is Benin's President Patrice Talon. He says that France should no longer keep the foreign exchange reserves of countries that use the CFA currencies. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with this report.
Since 1945, the CFA franc has been one of the major means of payment in Africa. At the time, the currency was known as the franc of the French colonies of Africa. In 1958, the currency was given a new name, franc of the French communities of Africa. While the CFA franc is perceived by some as a guarantee of stability, many see this currency as another form of colonization and are calling for its denouncement.
And the statement of the Benin President Patrice Talon is not yet very clear. If he had said, we the 8 WEMU countries decide to end the monetary cooperation with France, at this moment things would be clear. Because that would mean that African countries can be in full autonomy on the management of their own foreign exchange reserves. That there will no longer be French representatives in the decision-making bodies of their central banks, and that CIBOURS would be the one in charge of the monetary support and exchanges, which is not yet the case for now.
Today, there are 14 African countries that use the CFA franc. The West African CFA franc is used in 8 West African nations, namely Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. While the Central African CFA franc is used in 6 Central African countries. They include Cameroon, Central African Republic, Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Chad. Many of these African countries have voiced their support for ending monetary cooperation with France.
The competitiveness of our economies is a real problem. Our farmers are struggling to export their products, while the French continue to subsidize their products to the point that they can sell them at unbeatable prices at the local level. That is why we need a global movement of all the countries with an African unity, like the one that we tried to put in place hardly since 1960 before this termination.
It's not just economy experts. Heads of states and other leaders also want the currency denounced. In June 2018, a group of West African musicians released the rap song 7 Minutes Against the CFA, with lyrics calling the currency an instrument of repression. Those behind the song hoped to reignite efforts to get rid of the CFA franc.
I think that the question of the French franc should not even be asked, because it's a currency that's not good for Africans. It's an obsolete currency that must be removed altogether, and this should not even be an issue. But the real problem is that African states are pseudo-independent, because the stranglehold of France is always present. Normally, if you're independent, we should be able to deal on an equal footing with France and not allow it to interfere in our affairs. It is time for us to take control of our own destiny, to make our own money.
Under the monetary cooperation agreement with France, all 14 countries that use the CFA franc must deposit 50% of its monetary reserves in French treasury. Before 2005, that figure stood at 65%. In return, these countries obtain an unlimited convertibility with the euro, allowing them to establish their credibility internationally, especially with economic operators. But experts argue that half of the reserves held by France can be used to invest in local economies to improve the living conditions of people. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Australia's widespread drought is having a dramatic impact on the country's wool industry. The number of sheep in the world's largest wool-producing nation has been drastically reduced as the growing number of farmers simply can't afford to keep their stock. Here's CGTN's Greg Navarro with the details.
After surveying the brown and dusty landscape across this part of southern New South Wales, it seems like things can't get much worse. But Justin Campbell knows better.
We were dreadful before April for about a year and a half. You know, our feed costs were enormous, but
we're just quite lucky we're in a good patch at the moment.
That good patch for the Bonnock station, thanks to a minimal amount of rain, has relieved some of those costs and allowed people here to focus on shearing and bringing that wool to market. But not far from here and across large sections of the state, the lack of any meaningful rainfall has extended into a third season for farmers, many trying to cope without enough water and running out of options.
One of the problems as a result of this drought, the added costs that come with having to feed livestock instead of simply allowing them to graze. Those added costs for some farmers over time proved to be unsustainable.
So, you know, they're offloading their oldest age group and now they're selling the next age group and the next age group because they can't afford to feed.
That's led to near 100-year lows for sheep numbers in the world's largest wool-producing country, just 1 year after Australia's wool industry enjoyed record prices.
With wool prices at $15 or $16 a kilogram where they are at the moment, you can make money. You know, so it's not the wool price that's the inhibitor at the moment, it's the ability to keep the animal alive. And they're desperate to keep them alive, to grow the wool, to get the money.
Most of that wool goes to China, where the majority is processed and sold to other countries. The trade war with the U.S. has slowed some of that demand, but demand is still outstripping supply here, which is why wool prices at the moment remain competitive. But there's a concern about the long-term impact from the industry's shrinking supply.
This is the time when everyone does shear, so my gut feeling come December, January, February next year, there will be a lot of shortage of wool.
There's many things that we can do from a marketing and research and development body's point of view, and we can act on. There's other things we can't act on.
Including the one thing that people across much of Australia's east need desperately, to make it rain. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Conago.
I'll leave it there for the time being, but I'll be back at the top of the hour. In global business, tell me if you've heard this script before. Government in South Africa is warning that South African Airways may have some trouble paying salaries at the end of November. Why? We'll have some answers for you live at 1800 GMT. See you then. For now, though, back to Lindy.
Thanks, Rama. Well, let's take a short break. Here's what's still ahead on Africa Live. Coming up, we look at how Nigeria's indigenous games have stood the test of time.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
African traditional games play an important role in the daily routines of children, particularly in rural areas of Nigeria. Passed down through generations, games such as 10-10 and Tinko Tinko have stood the test of time. CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam tells us more from Abuja.
It's Chiameria's final chore for the day. The 14-year-old is set to head out to the famous Unity Tree in Masaka, a local community on the outskirts of the Nigerian capital, Abuja. Children and teens converge here for playtime and display a variety of Nigerian games, keeping them active and interacting with their peers.
Game 10-10 makes me smart because I get my opponents faster, so I win her within a short period of time. So it makes me think fast that which leg is she going to use to play the game, then I get her.
I feel happy. When it's time to go, I don't feel like going home.
There are several Nigerian traditional games that have existed for decades and passed down through many generations. From 10-10, where girls clap and move their legs rhythmically, to Ayo, where two players move seeds from holes made in the ground, and the player with the most seeds is declared winner. One of the favorite is Tinko Tinko. Here, two partners face each other, interchanging hands rhythmically with lots of clapping and singing. Apart from preserving the African heritage, these games prove to serve some health benefits for children.
All those games in the past used to help us excite, keeps us very, very active. But now, the kind of games children play now is more of a sedimentary game where you see them playing video games, sitting on a couch and playing lots of video games for hours, which is very unhealthy and which can cause obesity and childhood obesity. And childhood obesity can lead to type 1 or 2 diabetes in a child and also cause stress.
The surge in insecurity has pressured parents to restrict their children to indoor games. Experts are, however, positive that promoting these traditional games will produce more competitive and active children, both mentally and physically. Kelechi Amekalam, CGT and Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, to games of a different nature after the break, here's what's coming up in your sports. Nearly 100 golfers participate in this year's 14th edition of the Gulf Open in Senegal.
How would you create your